The title of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish titles which I've had the honour to carry for so long, I now pass to Catherine.
The order was devastating, precisely because there was nothing ceremonial about it. No public speech, no family photograph, no warning carefully wrapped in royal language. King Charles had made a decision inside Windsor that instantly redrew the private boundaries of his own household. Camilla was barred from an entire castle wing, and control of that floor was transferred directly to Catherine. What looked like a property decision carried a far more dangerous message about trust, access, and power. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat with the final page before him and read it again. Windsor Castle was not simply a home in this dispute. Inside the household, access to rooms, offices, and corridors represented closeness to the sovereign and influence over daily decisions. The written household order was clear. Camilla was barred from a designated private wing, while the entire floor, its rooms, schedules, and administrative access were placed under Catherine's control. The king paused at Camilla's name. A household order, in plain terms, was an internal directive telling staff how spaces and responsibilities were managed. He signed beneath the transfer clause, set the pen down, and said nothing. An equerry waited near the door, knowing the paper had completely altered the balance inside Windsor that day. Camilla received the decision in private, and the shock came quickly. She had expected a restriction, but not the removal of her authorization. Her expression tightened as she read that her key access would be withdrawn, and that staff schedules, correspondence, and internal permissions linked to the wing would now be redirected. She asked, "Was this permanent?" The answer was simple. It would remain unless Charles personally changed it. Catherine reacted differently. She did not smile or treat the transfer as a victory. When told that the entire floor now fell under her authority, she immediately understood what the decision would mean to Camilla. The princess knew that receiving power this way could look like triumph from outside, while feeling like humiliation inside the family. The closed door changed everything. Charles had not merely moved rooms around Windsor, he had drawn a line between access and trust, and everyone could feel it. Yet one question refused to disappear. What had happened inside the castle that made the king willing to shut his wife out and elevate Catherine in the same stroke? And when those closest to the family began examining who had gained, who had lost, and who had remained strangely silent, it became clear that this decision had struck far deeper than the walls of Windsor. For Camilla, Catherine, and Charles, the dispute was never truly about square footage. The castle floor had become a measure of something far harder to recover once lost: confidence. Camilla saw exclusion. Catherine saw responsibility she had never openly demanded. Charles saw a boundary he believed could no longer be avoided. And behind three carefully controlled faces were three radically different fears about what this transfer would now tell the rest of the family. Camilla sat with the authorization page still in her hands. She turned it over once, then again, as though another reading might reveal some softer meaning hidden beneath the words. None appeared. Her position as the king's wife had always carried an expectation of access within the household, while Catherine's growing role beside the future king gave her increasing responsibility within the monarchy's next generation. That was why this transfer cut so deeply. It placed the present and the future on opposite sides of the same locked door. Camilla looked toward the trusted aide beside her and asked the question she had been avoiding. Would her personal key still open the corridor? The aide hesitated before answering no. She said nothing for several seconds. The humiliation was private, yet that almost made it worse. Catherine had not simply received another room. She had been given the very access Camilla had lost, and the queen consort understood exactly how others inside Windsor would read that change. Catherine carried a different weight. She told William privately that she did not want anyone treating the transfer as a victory over Camilla. The prince watched her carefully and could see that she looked burdened rather than pleased. Her place beside the future king meant that added responsibility would always carry symbolic meaning, especially inside Windsor, where proximity to Charles could be interpreted as confidence from the crown. William reminded her that refusing authority already granted by the king would not calm the crisis. It could make Charles appear uncertain about his own decision. Charles remained firm. He had deliberately avoided calling the restriction a punishment, but the written order left little room for misunderstanding. Camilla could not simply wait for tempers to cool and walk back into the wing. Only his personal written authorization could restore her access. That detail made the decision feel less like an emotional reaction and more like a boundary designed to last. William knew why. Catherine noticed it in the way he chose his words, and in the silence that followed, whenever she asked what had pushed Charles this far. Finally, he admitted there had been one specific evening at Windsor that changed everything. Because the transfer was not born from months of vague tension alone, it could be traced back to one specific evening when a private disagreement crossed a line Charles refused to ignore. Every royal rupture has a moment that later seems inevitable. At Windsor, it came during a private reception, when a disagreement over Catherine's use of the castle wing stopped being an argument about protocol and became something intensely personal. Charles had tolerated irritation, competition, and quiet resistance before. What happened that evening was different. By the time one door closed and another conversation began, the king had already started considering an answer Camilla never imagined he would use. Catherine had been using several rooms in the wing for briefings connected to future duties, charitable meetings, and preparations involving William. Those briefings were working sessions where schedules, responsibilities, and upcoming royal engagements were discussed before decisions moved forward. Charles had approved the arrangement because Catherine's responsibilities were growing, and because the prince's future role meant their work increasingly required direct coordination inside Windsor. Camilla saw the same arrangement very differently. She had begun to view Catherine's repeated use of those rooms as an encroachment into an area tied closely to her own household influence. Tension had been building quietly, but the private reception changed everything. During the evening, she instructed a senior household officer to remove Catherine's scheduled briefing from one of the principal rooms, even though Charles had already approved it. The officer hesitated, but the queen consort repeated the instruction. Catherine arrived moments later and found staff moving her papers and changing the seating arrangement. She stopped beside the table and asked who had altered the king's approved schedule. Camilla answered that she had. The words were simple, but the meaning was unmistakable. Catherine refused to argue in front of staff, yet her silence carried its own shock. She gathered herself and stepped away, rather than turning the disagreement into a public confrontation. Charles saw the effect later. Catherine tried to dismiss what had happened, but he could tell she was shaken. William was far less restrained when he spoke privately with his father. The prince told him that the issue was no longer about one room or one meeting. If an instruction approved by the monarch could be overturned inside his own household, then the question had become one of authority. Charles summoned Camilla that same evening. He asked directly whether she had knowingly countermanded his approval. She did not deny it. Instead, she defended the decision and argued that Catherine's expanding presence in the wing had gone too far. The king listened, then ended the conversation without offering the compromise she expected. Morning brought the real consequence. Charles instructed the household secretary to begin a complete review of access rights connected to the floor. Camilla believed the review would restore balance. It would do the opposite. The paperwork had started the machinery, but only one conversation could make the separation real, and Charles chose to deliver that message himself. There are sentences that cannot be softened by royal etiquette. and Charles was about to deliver one of them. Camilla entered expecting boundaries, perhaps a warning, possibly a negotiated arrangement. What she heard instead stripped away every comfortable interpretation. Catherine was not borrowing the floor. The transfer was complete, and Camilla would no longer enter the wing unless the king himself reversed the order. For several seconds, neither husband nor wife moved. Charles sat opposite her, with the signed authorization resting between them. The document was the formal household instruction that now controlled who could use the rooms, who could enter the corridor, and which staff answered to the new arrangement. No wider family audience had been invited. No advisors were there to soften the language. The king wanted this understood directly, and he told Camilla that the Windsor wing had been reassigned to Catherine, and that her previous access had been withdrawn. Camilla stared at him before asking the question that had been burning beneath everything else. Had Catherine asked for this? Charles answered immediately, no. The decision was his. That reply wounded her more deeply than an accusation would have, because it removed the easier belief that she had simply lost a private rivalry. She was hearing that her own husband had chosen the boundary himself. Camilla pushed harder. How could one argument over a briefing justify losing an entire floor? The queen consort reminded him that she had only challenged the use of one room, not his position as monarch. Charles did not accept the distinction. He told her the problem had never been furniture, schedules, or one evening's disagreement. She had knowingly overridden an instruction he had already approved. To him, that was the line that could not be ignored. Camilla reached toward the authorization and read the relevant clause again. Her hand stopped at the sentence giving Catherine control over future household meetings scheduled within the wing. She pushed the paper back across the table without taking it. Charles left it where it was. The transfer now went beyond accommodation. It gave Catherine practical authority over how those rooms would function and who would use them. Camilla finally looked directly at him and asked whether he still trusted her. Charles hesitated. That silence did what no formal wording could. She understood that the wound was larger than Windsor, and he understood that answering too quickly would turn pain into something worse. Yet outside that room, the decision was already moving from emotion into action. William had begun reviewing how the new arrangement would work in practice. Charles had delivered the emotional verdict, but turning that verdict into reality required something colder than anger. Keys, staffing, schedules, and the quiet machinery of royal control. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. Sometimes it arrives as a changed key list, a revised staff instruction, or a name quietly moved to the top of an authorization sheet. That was what made the Windsor transfer so consequential. Charles had made the decision, but now the palace machinery had to decide what Catherine's control actually meant. And as William watched the details fall into place, the scale of his father's move became impossible to disguise. William stood beside Catherine as the implementation sheet was reviewed line by line. In simple terms, the household order did not make her owner of Windsor Castle. It gave her day-to-day control over the reassigned floor, designated working rooms, meeting access, staff coordination, and scheduling within that area. Charles still held the final authority, but the practical decisions now rested with her. Catherine hesitated before approving the first revised staff arrangement. The prince noticed immediately. She told him that every signature felt like another public reminder of what Camilla had lost. He answered carefully but firmly. She could not exercise authority while apologizing for having it. If she acted as though nothing had changed, she would not protect the queen consort. She would only make Charles's decision look weak. A household official entered with 2 sealed envelopes and placed them on the table. One was marked for withdrawal. The other was addressed to Catherine's office. She looked at both before accepting hers. The keys inside represented more than access. They confirmed who could authorize movement through the corridor, who could schedule meetings there, and which staff members now answered to the new arrangement. Catherine read further and stopped at the updated room list. Several spaces Camilla had once used informally were now being folded into her working suite. The change was sharper than she expected. William watched her reaction and reminded her that his father had drawn the boundary deliberately. Yet the document also revealed something important. Charles had protected private rooms unrelated to the dispute, leaving them outside the transfer entirely. That distinction mattered. The king was not erasing Camilla from Windsor. He was targeting the specific area where trust and authority had broken down. But emotionally, that precision offered little comfort. The queen consort would still feel the loss every time she passed a corridor she once entered without thought. And soon, she would not have to imagine the change any longer. For everyone else, the transfer existed on paper. For Camilla, it became real only when a familiar Windsor door stopped opening. The most painful consequence came without an audience. There was no family confrontation, no argument, no announcement. Camilla simply reached a door she had passed through countless times, presented the access she once relied upon, and discovered that Charles's decision had already traveled farther than words. The mechanism did not yield. Behind that locked entrance sat the clearest evidence yet that the balance inside Windsor had changed, and that Catherine now occupied the space Camilla could no longer enter. Camilla tried the access again, almost out of instinct. Nothing happened. By then, staff permissions, room schedules, and internal instructions had already been changed under Charles's signed directive, meaning the household was now required to treat the new boundary as active rather than symbolic. An embarrassed staff member stepped closer and quietly explained that the restriction had taken effect. She looked at the key in her hand, slipped it back into her bag, and walked away without asking anyone to intervene. Camilla carried that silence with her until she was alone with Charles later. She told him that hearing the decision had hurt, but discovering it through a door that no longer opened had felt worse. The queen consort did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The humiliation came from realizing that the order was no longer just between husband and wife. Staff now understood it. Schedules reflected it. The household itself had changed around her. Charles listened without interrupting. The king acknowledged that the moment had been painful, but he refused to reverse what he had signed. He told her that a boundary meant nothing if everyone expected it to disappear the moment it became uncomfortable. To him, restoring access immediately would turn the entire decision into a gesture rather than a consequence. Catherine learned what had happened soon afterward, and her first question was not about the door. She asked whether Camilla had been embarrassed in front of staff. When told that someone had been present, the princess became visibly uncomfortable. The new rooms gave her greater responsibility, but they also carried the human cost of another woman's exclusion. That was not something she wanted to celebrate. Catherine responded with restraint. She limited her first use of the reassigned rooms to official meetings and necessary work, refusing to make any change that might look deliberately possessive. She wanted the space to function, not to become a trophy. That decision reached Camilla in a way neither woman expected. Once the anger had exhausted itself, and the locked door had said what documents could not, two women were finally left with a choice: protect their pride, or speak without anyone standing between them. No private secretary sat between them. No king interpreted their words. No William stood ready to defend Catherine, and no aide softened Camilla's humiliation. For the first time since the Windsor Order, the two women faced each other without the palace acting as a shield. Catherine could have avoided the conversation. Camilla could have refused it. Instead, one entered the room the other had just lost, and what followed changed the emotional meaning of Charles's decision. Catherine chose a neutral sitting room away from the transferred floor. That mattered because she did not want the meeting to feel like a display of possession. Camilla arrived guarded and tired, carrying the weight of the locked corridor with her. The princess began carefully. She said she had never requested the floor and had not wanted the queen consort to discover the change through an embarrassing moment in front of staff. Camilla listened without interrupting. Then she admitted that Catherine's intentions were not what hurt most. The deeper wound was knowing that when Charles had been forced to choose whose judgment carried greater weight, he had placed authority behind Catherine. For her, the transfer was no longer about rooms. It was proof that the king had drawn a line and placed his wife on the losing side of it. Catherine refused to soften the truth with empty comfort. She told Camilla that pretending the transfer meant nothing would be insulting. It was a serious loss, and she understood why it felt personal. But she also made one thing clear. She would not use the rooms as a trophy, nor would she turn Charles's decision into a public victory over another woman. Camilla reached into her bag and removed the obsolete access key. She placed it on the table between them and said there was no purpose in keeping it now. Catherine looked at the key, but did not touch it. She told her it belonged with the household office, the staff department responsible for managing internal access and practical arrangements. She would not allow their relationship to be reduced to one woman physically handing power to another. That refusal changed something. Camilla finally accepted that Charles was not preparing to reverse the order. Catherine accepted something equally difficult. Carrying authority meant carrying the pain created by it. Neither woman apologized for everything. Neither suddenly forgot what had happened. But for the first time, they stopped treating each other as the entire cause of the crisis. The truce came too late to contain the story. Inside the castle, the confrontation had finally softened. Outside its walls, the story was only beginning to explode. By morning, a decision made behind Windsor's closed doors had become a national symbol. Commentators saw succession. Critics saw humiliation. Supporters saw discipline. And ordinary spectators saw something even simpler. One royal woman had been barred from rooms she once entered freely, while another had been placed in charge. The private language of keys and corridors had escaped into public view, and suddenly every gesture involving Charles, Camilla, Catherine, and William seemed loaded with meaning. The story spread because it touched several pressures at once. It was about marriage, hierarchy, access, succession, and the growing partnership between William and Catherine as the monarchy looked toward its future. A fictional morning front page captured the drama with brutal simplicity beneath a huge image of Windsor Castle. Windsor door shut on Camilla, Catherine given the floor. The headline turned an internal household decision into something the entire country could understand instantly. Outside the castle, a small crowd gathered near the public barriers, while television crews delivered live reports. Some people discussed whether the move showed Charles tightening control. Others saw it as another sign that Catherine was being trusted with greater responsibility beside the future king. The spectacle made the private dispute feel far larger than one corridor, because every interpretation now carried implications about who held influence inside the royal family. Catherine saw the front page before a scheduled engagement and briefly closed her eyes. She had tried to avoid treating Camilla's loss as her own victory, yet the public story had done exactly that for her. The princess understood that silence could not stop people from creating winners and losers. William noticed her discomfort and told her privately that public noise could not determine whether she fulfilled duties Charles had deliberately entrusted to her. Camilla felt the headlines differently. She was wounded by the language of exclusion and defeat, especially after the private understanding she had reached with Catherine. Yet the queen consort refused to demand that Charles issue a statement reversing the impression. She knew any public attempt to soften the story might reopen the very conflict they had only just begun to contain. Charles chose restraint. The king authorized only a narrow palace clarification, explaining that the arrangement concerned internal Windsor household access and responsibilities. That meant the issue dealt with who could use specific working areas and manage activity there, not ownership of the castle itself. Crucially, the underlying decision remained untouched. As the attention slowly settled, the deeper meaning became impossible to miss. The real story was never only about who controlled a corridor. It was about whose judgment Charles had chosen to reinforce when authority was tested. And once the headlines faded, Windsor was left with something far more permanent than public scandal. The consequences of a decision nobody inside the family could pretend had not changed them. In the end, the Windsor dispute was settled not by public opinion, palace gossip, or emotional pressure, but by the permanence of Charles's signature. Camilla remained part of his life, yet the boundary he imposed stayed intact. Catherine accepted the rooms without celebrating another woman's loss. William understood the transfer as a demand for responsibility, rather than privilege, and the monarchy emerged from the confrontation, carrying a message none of them could erase. Closeness to the crown did not guarantee unchecked authority. Charles kept the order unchanged. The king did not reopen the argument once the headlines faded, and he did not restore access simply to make the family appear more comfortable. Camilla remained barred from the designated wing, while Catherine retained control of the full floor assigned to her. That mattered, because the decision had never been about ownership of Windsor Castle. It concerned trust, working authority, and who could exercise responsibility within that specific part of the household. Charles walked through the reassigned area with Catherine several days later. He stopped at the doorway and told her simply to use the space well. Nothing more was needed. The monarch understood that giving authority was only the beginning. The real test was how that authority would be used. Catherine understood the same thing. She did not see the floor as a trophy taken from Camilla. She saw it as confidence placed in her judgment, with an expectation that she would exercise power without cruelty. Camilla eventually stopped challenging the restriction. The queen consort still felt the loss, but she recognized that continuing the fight would turn one painful defeat into a permanent family war. Accepting the boundary allowed her to preserve something more valuable than access to a corridor: dignity. She also understood that the crisis had begun when she crossed a line during the Windsor briefing dispute and challenged an instruction Charles had already approved. William watched Catherine's response closely. The prince saw in her restraint a lesson he would remember. Power is often revealed most clearly when someone has every opportunity to humiliate another person and chooses not to. She had gained the space, but she refused to turn Camilla's exclusion into revenge. The locked Windsor door therefore became more than the symbol of Camilla's loss or Catherine's rise. It marked the moment Charles separated affection from authority. Catherine accepted power without turning it into vengeance, and Camilla was forced to live with the consequence of crossing a royal boundary. The floor belonged to Catherine. The king's decision stood, and the monarchy moved forward with its hierarchy unmistakably redrawn. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.